Hello again, everyone. This is Mike with another portfolio image review, and this is another piece by Pride St. Clair. This piece has a lot going for it. It's very expressive. It uses color very nicely. The form is quite strong. The facial expressions are really nice and nicely drawn. In general, it just has a really nice overall feel, and I think Pride has a very good strength of sort of setting a scene and telling a story with a single image. There are, however, several areas where this piece could really benefit from a little bit of reworking, and the most notable is the lack of use of rulers in the mechanical elements. Whether you're working digitally or on paper, it's really important to take that little bit of extra time to make sure things that are mechanical are nice and clean and don't wave and have strange discrepancies in them. You can see here there's a pretty strong wave in this line. Things are just not even, and that really detracts from an otherwise beautiful piece. And when you're working digitally, one trick you can do if you're going to be sort of redrawing a lot of the same parts is you could actually create one piece, for instance, these gun barrels here. You could create one gun barrel on a separate layer, and when that is all nice and clean and rendered and straight, you could copy and paste it and move it around and stamp it down multiple times where you need it, shrinking it and reducing the brightness as necessary to create the ones in the back and so forth. And then to create this different perspectives in these holes or rivets here, you could create the holes or rivets separately. But doing stuff like that is a great way to save some time and to ensure that mechanical parts end up looking nice and clean. And aside from the obviously distorted and not finished mechanical aspects of the illustration, the other issue that's going to really stand out in the eyes of art directors is the lack of control of varied line width in this illustration, which seems to show a lack of understanding of how to use varied line width. And obviously varied line width means that the width of the line itself in the line art should change depending on the situation. And the simplest use of varied line width is to simply start a line very, very thin and pointy, and then get thicker as you go, and then shrink again to a thin line and a fine point at the end of the line. And that type of line width is great for fabric wrinkles and things of that sort. But also it's very important to keep in mind when you're doing line art and you're using varied line width to think of the line as a form of sort of built-in shading. You want your thicker lines to delineate a strong area, like the underside of things that's going to go into shadow. You can see here that this arm is almost not separated at all from this torso, and that's because of two things. That's because the shading isn't very strong down here, but also because the line art that should be separating the arm from the body is very thin, just as thin as anywhere else. Whereas on the other hand, up here, where the line should be very thin because it's up top on this cape and near highlighted colors, this is a case where the line should be very thin and you should rely purely on lighting and color to separate two shapes. Where there should be thick lines, they are missing, and that's creating not only lack of dimension in the illustration itself, but it's these are the sort of warning signs. These are going to give warning signs to art directors that this artist, while doing very nice stuff, does not understand some fundamentals that are going to result in art looking more mediocre than it could if he just learned a couple of things about line. So I'm going to get back into discussing line, and I'll show you some quick tweaks to the line to show you how it improves the image a little later. But first I want to get back to some other tips. Even if you start an illustration for your portfolio on paper, I cannot stress this enough. It's really the best thing to do is to work digitally. Even if you end up painting things with traditional media like gouache or acrylics or oils or watercolor, plan ahead and work in separate things. For instance, separate sections that are going to end up layers in a program like Photoshop or GIMP. So if you're going to have a background element, do that as a separate illustration if you're going to do it in traditional media, and then do the characters separately as well. And this will allow you to composite your final piece digitally and to make final tweaks extremely easily and to move things around. And because this piece was made entirely in traditional media on one surface, the artist does not have the means to very quickly tweak things. Once it's done, it's hard to change. As you can see, if you pay close attention, this background here behind the characters is supposed to be a city skyline. The problem is there's so little space behind the characters that you don't have a lot of room, a lot of real estate on the image to really show what's going on back there. Now, if Pride had worked digitally and in layers, he could have spent a lot of time perfecting which shapes are showing in this precious little negative space to really show that this is a city skyline. But he only had one shot at it, and this is the best it got. And I'm going to show you how. I'm going to turn on a layer where I very quickly cut out these characters so that I can, what I did was I brought in, I just stole this skyline from the internet as a demonstration. But as you can see, now that these characters are cut out separate from the background, now you can play as much as you need to with scale and positioning of every last individual building shape to make sure that the fact that it's a skyline becomes very clean and obvious. And basically, working in layers helps to make sure you get the most sense of depth and the best use of space. Another thing you might notice that's quite obvious about the difference of these backgrounds is, in this case, the city skyline is completely black. There are no lights, which might be part of the story. This image is very darkly lit. But if that's not part of the story, obviously the artist might want to decide whether or not lights would be a good idea to not only brighten up the image and add interest, lit windows, but also obviously to make it even more obvious that that's a city in the background. And then I just created a very sloppy translucent layer to make the reflected water darker and more simple. But anyway, this wasn't really made to be pretty, it's just to explain what I'm talking about here. Okay, so now that we are working in layers, I also created a layer with a brighter sky area to go behind. But again, that's just to make the point that once you're working in layers, you can make incredibly drastic adjustments extremely easily, and this allows you to just try every possible combination very quickly to make sure that the work you've put into your portfolio piece ends up with the best resulting image. So anyway, there's one last big thing about this image that could potentially improve, and that's the lighting and the shading within the color work. And obviously, like I said, improving or tweaking the line art to better emphasize dimension and cast shadows is a big step in the right direction. But I wanted to tell you about a cool, very easy technique to work on lighting in an illustration. Once you do your illustration and once you do your sort of foundation color work, one trick you can do, especially if you end up initially making your shading and lighting not strong or dramatic enough, is to simply duplicate the entire layer, in this case of the characters, whatever you want to tweak the lighting on, and to drastically increase the brightness and maybe the saturation of this new layer, and then simply use an eraser tool with an edge as fuzzy as you see fit, and just slowly start to erase out the areas that should be in shadow. And I'm sorry, it's running really slowly, so I'm not going to do too much of this, but you can see the idea how you can get very very bold shading very quickly across the entire image, no matter what colors are going on, because the layer has all of the color information in it. You can just work quickly with an eraser and get whatever large areas of light and shade you feel are necessary to get a lot better separation of parts. So here you can see I'm starting to separate the arm from the torso down there, and the arm from the cape, and because I knew this would run kind of slow, you get the idea, all I'm doing is erasing away some of this highlight layer in order to show the darker layer beneath, and I've done that here. Spent a little bit more time on it, but you can see how we go from lighting that's not very dramatic to lighting as dramatic as we need very easily here. And of course, one thing I always told my students, whether it was traditional painting or especially with acrylics or digital illustration, it's much better to go too bold or too strong on your first pass with something, because especially digitally, it's incredibly easy to do something like adjust the opacity of your highlight or your shading layer to make it as subtle as you want it to. So again, that's the power of working in layers and working in working digitally, is you can make massive adjustments extremely easy and really tweak every aspect of an image, whether it be lighting or placement of things, to really make sure your final image uses each aspect of the image as best as possible. So finally, I'm going to turn on this layer here, where I quickly sketched in some thicker line work, just to show how adding strategically placed thicker lines that taper as they go toward lit areas, which these thick lines emphasize where there's a separation of depth, where shadows would be cast, in other words, just gives the image a much stronger sense of dimension, and gives the image a much stronger feeling of confidence. It feels that the artist was much more confident with the form, and it really helped, especially on this side. This person's shirt here, there were lines that were oddly thick or overworked here in the sleeve, which are still there, but because I put much bolder, strong lines like here to delineate the collar and to cast the shadow and help separate the sort of cover to this pocket here, really helps reduce the significance of these lines, which should have been rendered a nice, much more thin and smoothly. But now it's not even that necessary to fix them anymore, because these thicker lines really help put the emphasis where it belongs. And I couldn't help it, I just very quickly by hand clean these lines up a bit, and you can see how much stronger the image looks with some cleaner, straighter lines in the mechanical areas and some stronger, thicker lines to help separate things. And again, I did this all really quick and sloppy. There's a lot of potential room here to tweak shapes and tweak colors and lighting especially. It's drastically different from the original. This was all just to make the point that you can really very quickly, working in layers, explore your placement and lighting and shading and everything else very quickly to make sure you get the most out of it. I guess that's it for this one.